All right. Hello. Welcome everyone to this session on after relocation on community well-being, cohesion, and livelihoods. My name is Anne-Christine and I'm part of the United Nations University, which is one of the organizers of this Climate Academy. I'm very excited to be here and moderating this panel. I'm just gonna wait a couple more seconds so everyone from the waiting room has time to come into the main room. And then we're gonna start right away with a very, very short introduction from my side, covering the topic of this panel, and then we'll start right away with the first presentation. Okay, we're seeing that a couple more people are still joining, but I think I'm just gonna go ahead and give you a few technical instructions. So I'm pretty sure you have maybe joined a couple of the other sessions. So this session is also being recorded and you'll get access to the recording of this session. The captions are also available in case you need them. Today we will hear 5 presentations from our panelists that I'm very excited about. Every panelist has about 10 minutes and we also have to be a little bit strict since we have 5 presentations in total. And we're gonna go through the presentations and then in the end we'll have about 30 to 25 minutes for the discussion, and all the participants are more than happy to use the Q&A function of Zoom to type in their questions, and we'll be happy to discuss them in the end. So a very short introduction of this session. As I said, it is on after relocations, on community well-being, cohesion, and livelihoods. And in this 1.5 hours, we're trying to answer the following 3 questions. So first of all, what are the long-term impacts and implications on residents' livelihoods after relocation? What are possible shortcomings, but also opportunities that come along with relocation? And what are the role of external actors, such as NGOs and governments, in the relocation process? And with that, I want to give the floor to our first speaker, who is Annah Piggott-McKellar. She's a postdoctoral fellow at Queensland University of Technology in Australia. And her research focuses on human and environmental interactions, specifically how populations are impacted by and adapting to changing climate, specifically through planned relocation in an Asian Pacific context. And with that, the floor is yours, Anna. Please share your slides and you have 10 minutes. Thanks a lot.
There we go. Thank you very much for that. So yeah, as I've just been introduced, my name's Annah Piggott-McKellar and I'm a research fellow at QUT in Brisbane. I'm not sure if my slide's working properly, but I'm just going to roll with it. So I'm going to be presenting today on a bit of work related to the relocation of the town of Grantham, which is 100 kilometres west of Brisbane here in Australia. It's some early research that I'm working on, so I'm just going to be sharing some sort of preliminary insights, as well as some other research that I've done on livelihoods related to relocation. And my slide, oh wait, there we go. Okay. So why focus on livelihood outcomes? So it's been spoken about throughout some of the sessions already. There's this legacy when it comes to relocation projects, stemming from a long history of development-induced and other forms of more coercive and involuntary resettlements. We've got this need to focus on livelihoods in climate-related relocation as to not make the same mistakes from those other forms of resettlement. And it's been noted in the guidance on relocation developed by Brookings Institute that states should ensure at a minimum the restoration, but ideally the improvement of livelihoods of relocated persons as both a matter of right and as an essential component in preventing impoverishment. So this is also built into other relocation policy. For example, the Fiji relocation guidelines has an emphasis on livelihoods, as well as Australia does not have relocation national guidelines, but we have a recent report emphasising the need for it, which also puts this emphasis on livelihoods. So we've been talking a lot about livelihoods, and we will be talking about a lot about livelihoods. So I just wanted to talk through, what we mean when we talk about, livelihoods more broadly. So livelihoods go beyond the economic and physical aspects to include the capability, assets, and activities required for people as a means of living a productive and full life. So in my research, I've conceptualized livelihoods based on the livelihood assets from the Sustainable Livelihood Framework, with the addition of the cultural dimension, which is key in relocation, given the challenge of moving away from land and the importance of place-based connections and the intertwined relationship between land, place, and culture. So with livelihoods, they can be defined across these categories, which are all interconnected. But there's the physical dimension, which is infrastructure, services, and facilities. Financial dimensions, which relate to income and savings. Social dimensions, which relate to social connectedness, familial relationships, and beyond that, sense of belonging. Human dimensions are around employment, education, health, disease. Natural dimensions relate to access to common pool resources, land availability and size, including productivity potential. And cultural dimensions, which, speak to language, cultural heritage, place attachment. So this slide just shows a literature review piece that I did a few years ago with some colleagues, and it was published in 2020, which looked at this legacy of other forms of relocation and resettlement. So we looked at 203 cases of resettlement induced by development, protected area management, tourism, and other forms, to look at the way that different livelihood dimensions were impacted. So given the nature of all the different types of, literature we're looking at, we had to make evaluative judgments based on the text as to whether the outcomes identified were positive, negative, or neutral. So as we can see here, the outcomes were largely negative across a lot of the livelihood dimensions, but particularly cultural outcomes suffered, and they were also reported on the least. But of those that were reported on, we can see 85% noted negative outcomes. The physical dimension had the most positive outcomes, which represents the sort of focus of projects with a primary impetus on, building new houses, building roads, and that sort of physical infrastructure, which often did lead to, improved outcomes in that space, but not always, as we can see. So yeah, this is just to set the scene, on what we know about livelihoods and the need and focus of them. So Grantham. Grantham is a very well-known case study in Australia and globally. It's sort of the only modern era example of relocation in Australia. We do have buyback schemes and some sort of managed retreat policies, but this is the only form of like a relocation of a community from one location to another, with some caveats built within that. So in 2011, a major flash flood event hit Grantham. The town had regularly flooded before that, and they were very well versed and comfortable with dealing with floods on a regular basis. Speaking to the risk perceptions from the session before, they were very comfortable with floods. However, the flood that hit during this period was like nothing seen before, and it's been described as an inland tsunami. 12 people died in this flood, and more died in the broader region. And most houses in the flood zone were completely destroyed. So in response, a reactive relocation program was developed and implemented very quickly. So 11 months after the flood, the first house was built in the new site. So this was able to be achieved as there was land the council could purchase close by, which I'll show on the next slide. And they were able to bypass the normal development approval processes due to pressure put on the state government, as well as media outlets from the devastating nature of the flood. There was a lot of attention on it. So this sort of speaks to that concept of, a last resort as well. So this is a very fuzzy, I apologize, picture of the relocation site. So this over here is the old relocation, the old Grantham town, and this here is the new site. So the houses here connected to the new site, these weren't flooded, so they've all remained. It's the houses along here that were destroyed in the flood and that relocated as part of this process. So there was a ballot process and people could walk around and choose which block of land they wanted. It was like for like, similar sizes of land they would receive. So while about 100 land titles were swapped, there were still several that did not swap, and they stayed in the old site. So Grantham has largely been viewed as a successful, there's that word again, successful relocation, given the close coordination across the different actors, which resulted in this quick relocation program. And it was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions how often these programs take years and years and years to be finalised, but this one happened so quickly, which is one of the reasons why it's viewed as successful. But in this research, I was really interested in how the community themselves viewed the relocation, and in particular, those that stayed behind, and how that has impacted their livelihoods and, you know, sense of belonging in the community. So with Grantham, there's often this focus on the process and on those that relocated, and it's very much overlooked in the literature and in the media that people didn't relocate, that some people chose to stay. I use that word loosely. So some of the preliminary insights from the research so far is the significant financial burden of the relocation. And for those that relocated, that was seen as a necessary, you know, burden. But for some people, that was one of the reasons and one of the barriers they weren't able to participate in the relocation process, especially amongst some elderly populations that weren't able to take out loans at that time. There was also a lack of public transport in the new site, which was a concern for some of the residents. So the relocation has led to safety from flood events for the relocated households. We've just had major flood events recently in the last couple of years along Australia's east coast, and the houses that remained in the old site were devastated by these floods again, not to the point of the 2011 floods, but there's now been buyback schemes implemented in the region to try and help some of those houses that remained, which they have had their own barriers to involvement. The land quality in the new site is reduced. You know, it's out of the floodplain. A lot of people had sort of hobby farms that they're not able to use anymore because of the state of the land. And there's a lot of ongoing trauma associated with the flood because it was such a severe event. But specifically talking about social capital, this was impacted, as one of the members from the old site who didn't relocate said in an interview, that there might as well be a foreign country up there. So it really feels like this split in the community. Even though it's been only a very short distance of relocation, it's had quite a large impact. And the picture up here, the top left, is the artist's impression of the commercial hub in Grantham, which shows, you know, a bustling community with lots of markets and lots going on. But as you drive through Grantham, it's very much, you know, that's not the case. It's a community that's sort of in decline. There's one shop, a petrol station, and a cafe. And they lost the pub in the flood, and that wasn't rebuilt as part of the relocation process for various reasons. But, you know, in Australia, especially in rural areas, you know, the pub is a key tenet of sort of culture and social belonging. How am I going for time? Am I pushing it, or?
You have like 1 more minute, 1.5.
Oh, wow, there we go. Talk fast. All right. So I just want to talk about some final sort of thoughts I had, which are sort of bigger picture things. And I was just sort of, writing them down before, but this idea of, are people better off in Grantham? So largely, yes, people are better off. People that relocated, there were some aspects of the relocation that weren't fantastic for them, like the financial costs. But, you know, they feel safer where they are, and that is that's the main reason. After the traumatic event that they went through, the relocation has been really successful. But this isn't the case for everybody. There were people that were left behind, and as you drive through sort of Grantham and see old Grantham and new Grantham, you can't help but feel that the people that remained were left behind, and some of those feel like active choices, while some of them fit more along the spectrum of you know, voluntary and involuntary immobility. And there's this idea that, you know, every person has a unique background, unique perspectives and set of values. And it raises that question of, is it possible for a relocation program to be truly successful for everyone involved in the long run? because there's always going to be, for example, the trust that people had in the local council played a big role into how much they engaged in the relocation program. And just people's underlying values around what relocation should include and what it should look like and how community consultation should take place. There's lots of variables here that sort of, raise that question of can a relocation program that's aiming to help so many people move out of a region of high risk be successful for everyone involved. So the separation of community during relocation, even over short distance, can lead to poor social outcomes if it's not planned well. And this is something that I've seen in Fiji as well with case studies I've looked at over there. You would think even if it's a small distance, things, that you wouldn't necessarily, you would think, that's kind of, not too bad. But when you get down to it and it's people's everyday lives and everyday connections, it has, can lead to poor social outcomes. So we definitely need more research into the implications of relocation for immobile populations. And I've said along that blurry line of voluntariness, as well as those who relocate. We definitely need to be supporting communities to remain if that is their wish for as long as possible. I believe that. But I think we also need to look at what that means for people's livelihoods, especially if other people in the community move. And we need long-term comparative and longitudinal analysis of relocation outcomes to track livelihood changes over time, which is something that I'm focusing on in the next few years, hopefully, as I've just received a research grant to do some more research in Australia and Fiji on relocation, looking at outcomes and other factors. But I'll wrap up there.
Thank you so much, Anna, and congratulations, of course, for the grant. Thanks for getting us started. And now we're moving directly to our next panelist. So we're moving from Grantham, Australia to an African context. And we have Olumuyiwa Adegun here with us from the Federal University of Technology in Nigeria. And his research centers on environmental sustainability in low-income housing, such as slums and informal settlements in cities across sub-Saharan Africa. And please, Olumuyiwa, it's your turn now. Please share your screen and you have 10 minutes. We're excited for your presentation.
Yes, thanks, and Christine. I want to confirm that you can all see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Again, good afternoon to the panelists and the participants. It's a pleasure to be part of this Climate Academy and to share my work and learn and contribute how we can make relocations better. I was speaking in a research I conducted a few years ago. It actually stemmed from my PhD. My PhD looked at informal settlement interventions in Johannesburg, South Africa. My inspiration for that work came from a question about what happens when people move from informal settlements to new housing. As many of you might know, Africa has a significant challenge around informal settlements in cities, quite a high percentage in sub-Saharan Africa. From the latest statistics available, it's over 65% of urban residents living in informal settlements or area regarded as slums. So different states across the countries have developed mechanisms to move people from informal settlements to new housing constructed at times in far-flung areas, at times in neighboring areas to those slums. So that's the dominant approach across sub-Saharan Africa and I think elsewhere. So in this work, I look at 3 case studies of such relocations in sub-Saharan Africa. First, I'll look at the case in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I'll look at Nairobi, Kenya, and I'll end it with a case in South Africa, Johannesburg. So, like I earlier said, informal settlements is a significant challenge in cities in sub-Saharan Africa. The statistics available shows over 80% of Addis Ababa's residents live in slums, and then the approach has been to clear the slums and move people into proper housing. So like the pictures you have here are slums in Addis Ababa, Arat Kilo slum and Gimfo slum, showing the situation in this informal settlement. And people in the informal settlement have been moved to this new housing you can see on the screen. It's actually part of Ethiopia's ambitious housing program to develop new units for people living in slums, and much of this housing are located in periphery areas of Addis Ababa, and it's has delivered tens of thousands of units through this program, which started around 2005, 2006. So a study looked at the impact, what's happening in the slum versus what's happening in the IRS apartments in terms of environmental aspects. My work focused on environmental aspects and the social aspects. Social aspects includes livelihood. And this study showed that, I mean, the summary is that within the IRS apartment, there are opportunities for resource conservation, more opportunities for prudent use of resources. If you compare the volume of water consumed in a day within the slum by an household to the volume of water compared used in the IRS apartment. The same thing for energy, and which also translates to the aspects of waste. So when people move into this new high-rise apartment, there are opportunities to reduce resource consumptions. It's not the same for the economic dimension, not exactly the same, but I think it's the same pattern. So the study looked at the conditions in the slum in terms of employment and the conditions in the IRS apartments as well. So the trend is that employment reduced, unemployment reduced, while employment rate increased. So for example, people working in private organizations moving from 30% to 45%, and employment dropped from 29% to 7%. So average income also increased from 10,000 units of the currency to 17,000. Education also improved because more people had education, less people had the little form of education, that's the primary education. But the case is reversed for the social dimension. So the environment created opportunities in terms of conserving resources, the economy improved, but the social capital dropped, because when people moved into the IRS apartment, the sense of community is significantly lost. So people rated that within the slum, there is a high level of community, whereas in the IRS apartments, there is low sense of community. 80% felt happy within the slums, compared with 50% who really felt happy within the new housing. The same to sense of security, which significantly dropped. People who had access to informal networks for borrowing also dropped. And the level of trust dropped because, for example, within the slums, people felt about 97% trusted their neighbors. But moving to the new housing, this dropped to about 34%. And this gives a picture of what happens before relocation and after relocation. So I'll quickly move to Nairobi, which is also the same pattern of relocating from slums. I wouldn't go into the statistics of how many people living in slums in Nairobi, but there is the KENSUP program, the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program, which started in around 2004. And a significant part of this program has been to build new housing for people living in Kibera. And if you've ever been to Kibera, you might be familiar with this picture of the decanting site, initially proposed as a decanting site. These are the multi-stories with the red roof at the foreground, and you have the slums to the back, closer here with the rusty zinc roofs and crammed together where people live. So the idea is to move people from the slums into this high-rise structures, and that has been happening in phases. So the decanting, moving people into the decanting side was the first phase, and subsequent phase had been completed. So what you have with the blue strip rendering is another phase of the housing developed for people from slums. And this picture captures these two settings, and the fence as a barrier between the slums and people within the new housing. So what has happened is that people who got the unit, so this housing is meant for people within slums. So you're meant to move from the slums so the state can clear the housing to build more in future. But the reality is that about 50% of those who got the units no longer reside there. So you get the units and you move. So it's either you sell it or you give it away or you rent it out. And the connection to the slums is still very strong because people still come to the slums to buy grocery. It's just a walk away, and people who felt a stronger sense of community or who had health challenges choose to remain in the slums, like the 60-year-old woman who has a swollen feet and preferred the bungalow shack to climbing stairs in the new housing where he got. And paying the mortgage was also a challenge because this is not free housing. You have to pay over a period of time, and not everybody has been economically elevated to pay for that unit.
Very sorry to interrupt, but you have about 30 more seconds. Just a short reminder.
Okay, so it's the same situation in Johannesburg, South Africa, where people were moved from slums to new housing. And in this case, the housing is given free to qualifying households. And it's actually the same challenge of livelihoods, of community within the slums, the connections and the networks. And then the challenge of moving into a new house where you have to pay for electricity, you don't rely on firewood, you don't use charcoal again, you have to rely on electricity. And without significant economic empowerment is a challenge. And which brings me to the conclusion that we need a just sustainability conceptual framing in order to address relocations. I know these are relocations in socioeconomic terms, but also in the sense of climate response to climate issues. It's necessary to always combine the justice perspectives and the different dimensions of sustainability where necessary to make the relevant trade-offs. I'm going to end it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very exciting work. And now we're moving from an African city context to Iran with a very niche but super exciting topic that will be presented by Ms. Narjes Zivdar. She's a development researcher and practitioner at the United Nations, Iran, and she has a background in climate justice and injustice, as well as community resilience. And with that, I'll give the floor to you. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. Today I'm going to talk about my research titled Grassroots Insight into Risk and Resilience, Rethinking the Role of Community in Climate-Induced Relocation for Afghan Refugees in Iran. Just quickly, this research is based on the empirical studies and critical reflection on my field experiences, and they do not necessarily represent the views of the organization I work for. I will first go through the introduction of Afghan displacement and the climate risk for the refugees in Iran, followed by the analysis of climate-induced relocation and the finding and recommendation of this research. 42 years on since the 1979 Syrian invasion, followed by the US war as of 2001 and the Taliban takeover in 2021, have resulted in the longest protracted refugee situation in the history, which is Afghan displacement. Iran is the second largest refugee hosting country. About 3.8 million Afghans who have been forced to flee their home are currently living and settled in Iran. This map, which shows the no-go area for the refugee populations in the country, demonstrate that the displaced population are entitled to leave, move, or travel within limited urban areas in the country, which are the white parts. And those provinces are actually located in highly at-risk region in terms of climate impacts. As a result of drastic drought and flood events in those provinces and generally in Iran during the last few years, many refugee groups have to migrate from one province to another to diminish loss, damage, and all the impacts caused by climate-induced disasters. In order to address those challenges, every now and then, some planned relocation activities are being implemented by the government and international agencies in the country. But the point is that the implementation of those interventions are rarely successful because they are often happening in a top-down manner, mainly planned and implemented by the government entities and authorities, overlooking the people's views of risk and their demands and their daily struggles. And when it comes to those interventions, the genuine civil society organization and NGOs inputs and insights are being overlooked as well. Those relocation also fail to prevent or minimize the environmental risk in the new settlements. Because if if you look at those maps, when the planned relocations are being planned, we usually relocate people from a province affected by a kind of climate impact to another province, which is actually located in a high-risk region as well. In a way of an example, Tehran, the province the city that I actually live in, is one of the key destinations for relocation of refugees under the justification of having access to livelihoods opportunities and health facilities. But the point is that an analysis of the flood hazard exposure highlights that the southern part of the city and water valleys, the vicinity of the water valleys, river valleys, are actually the most exposed areas to the flood. And surprisingly, those are the locations that the displaced population, Afghan refugees, and poor urban residents are living in. Most of those areas are not linked to drinking water supply and wastewater network. And in case of drought, they're not going to have access to a proper water network system. And as a result, the refugees who already lack access to essential services are going to be impacted and exposed to the risks of climate impacts. If we quickly look at the IPCC's schematics of key drivers of climate risk, we're going to see that socio-economic processes, as discussed, are actually key drivers of core components that constitutes climate risk in terms of vulnerability and exposure of those populations to climate risks. And if we dive deeper into the gaps in the institutional and governance systems and arrangement, we're going to see that those interventions are predominantly being done, planned, assessed by the government organization, and we are now facing with a big drawback, the omission of a facilitator of communication and mediator between community members and marginalized group and formal institution. And without such an actor, neither the government authorities would notice the real life challenges of those population, and people who are affected cannot properly express their demands. On the other side, the form of community participation, which is being deployed by development agencies, have also some shortcomings. They are rigidly designed to deliver a limited number of predefined outcomes, responding to external priorities. At the same time, when we want to implement a project or plan it, we do have certain, for instance, procedure for partner detention, for needs assessment, which needs to be done in line with rules and regulation and the national plans, which are implemented nationally, which sometimes have some conflict with what we want to do in terms of community engagement. And as a result, those processes are mainly mediated by local individuals who represent existing unequal power relations within the refugee community. The certain entities that are allowed to be the representative of a certain community. So these inequalities are even reinforced by the development intervention, which is of concern. For instance, when we focus on the development of collective identity, community development approaches that we adopt are often nurture a divide between us and them, which can exacerbate the conflict between those not included. For instance, the undocumented refugee populations who are the majority of Afghans living in Iran. But all in all, those paradoxes and challenges need to be acknowledged, but should not stop community-based work, but to reinvigorate it. And the role of genuine community-based organizations, civil society organizations, need to be acknowledged to inform the policy and decision-making at the time of need assessment for the planned relocation, at the time of implementation, and even the monitoring and evaluation of such interventions. And I also suggest studying the grassroots insight into urban risk and resilience. Iran and Afghanistan do have shared knowledge on climate resilience, traditional water management system, for instance, that I somehow had conducted some research on in another papers and researches. And I think those kind of collective capacity need to be enhanced to generate genuine partnership between the community, CSOs, and local government. Those interventions in terms of planned relocations, climate-induced relocation, they have kind of some kind of capacities to provide opportunity to save lives and assets of the refugees in Iran. But if they are, if done through inclusive plans, inclusive of the people that we are relocating them, the host community, and the ones that we often left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation and highlighting the vulnerability of Afghan refugees in Iran. Thanks a lot. Now we're proceeding with Dr. Carolien Jacobs, moving from Iran again to an African context, more specifically Mozambique. She is an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She has a background in law, governance, and international development, with a special focus on conflict-affected countries such as the Congo and Mozambique. And with that, I'll hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you and we see your slides.
Good, perfect. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Mozambique, which is a country with quite a long history actually of relocation and resettlement, ranging from forced labor during colonial times, villagization in socialist times, conflicts, natural disasters, development projects, private investment, nature conservation, exploitation of resources. So in that sense, relocation is something that is not super strange for people, and therefore I guess it's also a little bit easier for the government to convince people to get relocated. So one of the strategies the Mozambican government, through its National Institute for the Management of Disasters, uses to reduce disaster risk is to remove people living in high-risk areas to safer places. And partly this is a process that is going on already for a long time, but it got a strong boost after Cyclone Idai in 2019, when many people lost their homes and were also more willing to accept relocation, as they simply did not have an alternative option, but also realized that, well, this was something that they did not anticipate could happen, at least not in that intensity. So what I present here is how the relocation after Cyclone Idai is unfolding, based on research which I conduct together with my colleague Bernardo Almeida, who is also attending this session, and which we also hope to continue in the coming years. So the following are quite preliminary reflections on findings which we gathered last month, and which we compare now with findings from 2019, and also some reflections on what we consider urgent challenges that need more policy attention. I should admit that we haven't done full analysis of the data yet, and I guess the paper is also therefore more empirical than an analytical reflection, but I'm very keen, also on the basis of all the input that I've gotten already throughout this week, to further develop these thoughts. But yeah, happy to hear your suggestions on this as well. So you may recall that in March 2019, Cyclone Idai made landfall in Southern Africa, especially the central part of Mozambique was severely affected. And the main response then was to relocate people instead of helping them to rebuild their original homes. So in the first months, more than 80,000 people were relocated. So from temporary accommodation centers, they were divided over a number of different sites. Generally, people did not have a choice on where to go. The relocation sites would become basically the shared new community of people coming from different areas, where they then had to also build a new community together. So in 2019, we found that many international organizations were slightly reluctant about the idea of relocation, but nevertheless engaged with it, also because the state Mozambican government was quite strongly in the driving seat in setting up the intervention, and organizations did not have much choice. If they wanted to engage, they had little option but to go with supporting that solution. And that applied to some extent also to people who got relocated. Most of them felt they did not have a choice to go against the decision of the government to be relocated in the first place, nor to go against the choice of the particular relocation site. So we found quite some mixed feelings. There were people who were relocated from a coastal neighborhood in the second city of the country to a place 60 kilometers away, completely disconnected from the urban petty livelihoods that they used to have. Others came from places closer by and would still have access to their agricultural fields and continue cultivating. So they didn't have as much problems in sort of rebuilding their lives. So some would say, well, we're completely in the bush here, and others would say this is the promised land for us. And they believed that over time things would become better. A common denominator, though, was, I think, both from the side of the relocated people, but also from the side of international organizations, from the government, what would happen once the emergency aid would end. So by then, most aid was supposed to last for 1 year until after the cyclone. So issues which we noticed, which would deserve attention for follow-up research, was first the evolution of relations between host communities, neighboring communities, and relocated people. So host communities were basically asked to give up their land for the residential plots of these newcomers, playing into the widely held idea that, which is based on Mozambique's land legislation, that all land belongs to the state. But at the same time, ignoring that same land law also says that people have rights of use over land, even if they don't have a formal title over that land. So people did not get compensation, but they were sort of supposed to show solidarity and to simply give up their land. The people who were relocated did get residential plots, but they did not get access to agricultural lands, which was quite, well, that's basically the thing that you need if you're relocated to rural areas without other means or opportunities of livelihoods. So the question then is how to turn relocation into a durable solution and move from planned relocation to resettlement in a way, sort of rebuilding also community, re-establishing social and economic conditions. By then, we also pointed out expropriation as a hidden risk of relocation, where people both in the place from where they got relocated from and people in the host communities do not get fair compensation, for instance, simply because there's no clear procedure on how to do this. So last month, we visited 3 relocation sites in Mozambique, and we conducted about 40 interviews there. You see quite a lot of changes. So in that sense, I guess with some of the presentations earlier today, we are not so pessimistic. So the tents, which we still saw a lot in 2019, have been replaced by what people would say semi-durable houses. And there is a process of construction of more durable, improved houses with government and international support. A lot of these houses are not finished yet, but it does give a sense of optimism, of sort of a feeling that things will turn for the better. And the houses are quite uniform, so it's not a completely consultative, participatory process in which people have a say in what they will get. So you basically have 2 types of houses depending on the size of the family. But here in the middle, I put a picture of a box for complaints and suggestions, where you can file your complaints to the Disaster Management Institute. So there's some efforts being made to be more participatory. Overall, well, people are happy about the prospect of receiving better houses. They're also happy about owning houses, whereas often before they would rent houses, they would rent land. So now most people also manage to obtain access to land on their own initiative. It's not through government support. There's also some community cohesion. We are all a family now. Life is better. Life is normal. We don't feel insecure anymore. There's lots of complaint about lack of employment and business opportunities, but the district administration also told us that they are working on setting up more development-oriented activities. So overall, not too negative, I think. And people feel more secure in terms of climate risk, but also in terms of land ownership and of rights they have over the residential plots, but also of the access they have to land. And we see that the Disaster Management Institute is also constantly sort of adjusting its approach and trying to improve how relocation is being done. Now, it goes into too much detail, but yeah, I guess also on the basis of the science, which you see here, you see that it's still a process. There's lots of international actors still providing support, of which these signs are testimony, I guess. So it is a process that is still going on, which also shows the importance, I guess, of longitudinal research on this. Questions which we continue to have and which I guess are also concerns and for the future, also for follow-up research, is will improved conditions become available for all? So will everybody receive a house? But what will this mean as well, also in terms of solidarity from neighboring communities, from host communities who have given up part of their land to accommodate these newcomers, but now see these newcomers actually in better conditions than they are living themselves. So building back better or sort of improving a situation is of course a laudable objective, but if it's sort of, if it means building back better than the neighbors who have actually abandoned their land for you, it could also create friction. And then there is a question, of course, as well, and the Mozambican government is working on this. Like, if you empty areas which are seen as risk areas, how do you prevent other people from making use of that land again, of occupying it? Because several people said, well, we've abandoned our land, but now there's other people who are using it again. So that there is a risk of having this perpetual cycle of having to relocate people after a next disaster hits. So in sum, I guess important to realize that relocation is a long-term process, that you also need to study from a longer-term perspective, and that if you take just snapshots, you also get just a partial image. I think while we were there, while construction of houses was going on, people were relatively positive. But if they see, like, there were some houses of which construction had started already 1.5 years ago, for people who were supposed to receive houses with priority because they were more vulnerable. But the project funding had run out of money and the houses are still unfinished. And these people who were supposed to be more vulnerable to receive houses earlier are now still waiting while others are already receiving a house. You could imagine that if expectations will not be met, that this positivism will also dwindle very quickly. The risk of expropriation, the relations between settlers, long-term settlers and newcomers, security of property rights continue to be relevant. And then there is also the question of how do you deal with these risk areas, and what do you allow and do you not allow there, where I guess there's also sort of a policy question related to that. So that's the snapshot, I guess, from Mozambique, and our first initial thoughts about how things are going. But overall, yeah, a bit in line with some of the a little bit more positive stories that we've heard this morning as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carolien, for this highly needed longitudinal study. I think we've all been waiting for that. Now we have Dr. Ryan Alaniz, who's the last but not least presentation of the day. And we've had a wide range of topics, and now we'll hear a little bit more about the role of NGOs and governments in this whole relocation process. Ryan is a professor and department chair at the California Polytechnic State University in the US, and he has a background in sociology with a focus on post-disaster recovery, resettlement, and community development. And with that, I give the floor to you. Thanks a lot, Ryan.
Thank you. I just want to make sure you can hear me and see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've been to other UNU academies and they're always amazing, but this one in particular really feels like it's in my wheelhouse as I looked at post-disaster resettlements in Honduras. So the title of the presentation is From Strangers to Neighbors. This is a unique situation because what I looked at was 7 different resettlements after Hurricane Mitch. So Hurricane Mitch happened in 1998, devastated the nation. It was a Category 5 hurricane that sat on the edge of the northern coast of Honduras for 3 days. bombarding it. More than 10,000 people died, and every bridge in the country was either damaged or destroyed. So it devastated the nation. The nation itself was considered a fragile state beforehand. When it came to relief, the state government, or the government of Honduras, had $0 to actually deal with the situation, and so immediately turned to U.S. Agency for International Development and World Bank. And I say involuntary resettlement because individuals who were at risk had to move to temporary shelters, and from those temporary shelters, they did over time have to choose one of multiple resettlements to live in. And so they were eventually forced out of these temporary shelters, but they did have time to make decisions about which resettlement they would want to move to. So my research looked at as I mentioned, 7 of these resettlements. I'm drawing on Tony's term of resettlement because I'm a Latin Americanist, but really looking at social health. And I use social health because the context of Honduras is very different than, say, what Robin presented yesterday of Alaskan indigenous folks, or the 4 presentations beforehand. It's the 2nd poorest country or 3rd poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and it is one of those violent nations, and has been one of those violent nations in the world outside of warring nations, due to gang conflict. And so I used a grounded theory approach to see, well, what were the most important characteristics for survivors that they thought would make a successful resettlement. And what I found was these 5 intertwined and self-reinforcing characteristics. Low crime was by far the most important element. Social capital, collective efficacy, which is, if you're not familiar with the term, the idea that neighbors are willing to look out for other neighbors, and there's a sense of social control within the community, because if you can't rely on the police, you can't rely on the government, then there needs to be some type of social control. Civic participation or engagement with, in terms of voting, community projects, etc., and vision. Did they have a positive vision for their future of their community? And was the vision fragmented, or was it cohesive? If it was fragmented, that often meant a lot of conflict. And so of the 7, I really focused on 2. And what I found was, again, I was looking at these resettlements 12 years after Hurricane Mitch, so 2009, 2010, was that there was a very significant vulnerability. I imagine all of us on this call, say there's 50 of us in our families, and we all have to relocate somewhere. That's going to be really challenging for us to find a way to continue to make money to feed ourselves. It's also going to be hard for us to create new political institutions if we can't rely on the government. And then on top of that, how do we create trust? How do we ensure that there isn't maybe one person with a lot of power who takes over? So individuals, these resettlements that I looked at, there was such significant vulnerability to external forces and to the internal workings of what we think of as community. So these vulnerabilities led to the need of support from organizations. And so that's what I really focused on, is how did these 7 resettlements with 7 different NGOs come to support these different resettlements over time? And what were the processes that they utilized and strategies that they utilized? And what were the outcomes? And can we compare them? And so I will just say, I believe that they were comparable based on the demographics. And looking at the resettlement development strategy, I asked each of the directors of these nonprofits, so what was the theory, or what were the concepts or ideas that you utilized and that you drew upon to rebuild or to build these new resettlements and to essentially try to help them become self-sustaining and healthy? And every single one of the 7 said, we drew on nothing. We just winged it from the very beginning. And so it occurred to me that there's a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of people doing this type of work, but they didn't have the guidance necessary to be, or they couldn't find the guidance necessary to be successful. And so I took it upon myself to say, well, what worked and what didn't work? And so, like a good academic, I came up with an acronym, SAGE. And the first part of SAGE is the idea of sustain. So an organization, if it's going to be working with survivors, in this case, or people being resettled, must be able to provide the basic necessities. So food, water, shelter, security. If they can't do that, then you can't move forward elsewhere in terms of the other issues of political and social and economic institutions. The second is a company. So the organization should partner, collaborate with, developing a new culture. And this is something I really didn't see in the literature, and Tony spoke to a little bit. In the case of these 7 resettlements, there wasn't a heritage. There wasn't people bringing as a group their previous culture. They came from disparate neighborhoods, and they had different ideas about the way things should be. And when they all came together, this created a lot of problems because they often competed with their different ideas about how this community should be run, where and how the market should be created, etc. So it was really incumbent on the organization to support the dialogue with residents over time to develop this new culture. I'm going to speak to that in just a moment. Third, and I think we would need this, even though we study this, I think we would need some support to create worthwhile political and economic institutions. Economic institutions, I'm thinking about livelihoods in particular. In the case of Honduras, to protect the neophyte communities from external threats like gangs or other external forces that may want to impede upon the development of the new community. And of course, provide technical assistance. Even though we are all experts in the area of relocation, I'm sure we would need help fixing our well, for example. And finally, empower. There must be a recognition that the organization will be leaving, of course, and it will be leaving at some point, X number of years over time, and that there needs to be not a power vacuum. So a handing over of responsibility and providing and ensuring that people have the capabilities and the capacity to run their own political institutions, to be able to maintain their own economic livelihoods, and to be able to protect their culture and social milieu that they've developed over time. So just a couple of final thoughts. We know, we're all aware that infrastructure is not sufficient, and yet this keeps happening. I just want to share one story of a US NGO that came in. They were the first ones on the ground after Hurricane Mitch. They bought land and they said, we want to help the most vulnerable survivors. And so they're like single mothers and their children. That's our target. And so they built 285 homes. They put in water. They put in a road. They brought the women in, they took pictures, and then they left. And they went off and started another project. Within 6 months, a gang came in, took over the whole community, and each woman had to pay an impuesto de guerra, a war tax, in order to stay in her new home. And so this idea of just building infrastructure actually failed these women compared to living in their previous kind of transitory location. Residents need support, survivors need support, and they need support over time. And I think that's really come to the fore in all of the presentations today and what we've been talking about. So how do we navigate if, as scholars, but also as maybe practitioners or people talking to these NGOs, these government agencies, how do we prevent the kind of colonial mentality of going in and saying, we know what's best? How do we collaborate with and participate alongside and support the residents to create the community that they want? Resettlement can be an opportunity. Again, in the cases that I studied, it was a blank slate. So these resettlements, individuals came together and there was no culture. They could build it from scratch. And so in this case, what in some cases was built was actually much healthier, quote unquote, healthier than the neighborhoods that they came from before. There was less fear of crime. There was more trust. There was more civic participation. And I used the theory of path dependence, which is the picture on the bottom there with the ball on the top of the hill. So imagine a snowball on the top of a round hill. Whichever way it's pushed, it starts to grow and gain momentum. And I argue that with resettlements, especially with people, strangers coming together to live together, the first cohort, the first year, first 2 years, whatever culture is set then, whatever expectations are set then, create and gain its own momentum. And it becomes very tricky to move or change that culture. So if there's a culture of spousal abuse, if there's a culture of machismo, if there's a culture of throwing trash on the ground and not picking it up, if there's a culture of no trust and people just being afraid of one another, or the opposite, if there's a culture of people really volunteering their time to make the community better, over time, as new cohorts come, that's the expectation that's going to be set, and that's the culture that's going to last 10, 12, 20, 30 years, arguably. And so with that, I'll close and pass it back to Anne-Christine.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for this very insightful presentation. And I'm also very excited now for the discussion part. We have about 20 more minutes, which is great. And I've seen that in the Q&A, we're getting lots of awesome questions. And I see that everyone has been also very busy answering them already. But I would like to bring the questions by Hannah and Pace also to this broader discussion now, and do not just let them be in the chat, on the conflict between communities that decided to stay and those that moved. And I would like to ask Anna to maybe kind of summarize her answers and her insight on this conflict and how to go about it and whether it makes sense to have mandatory relocations. Thank you, Anna.
Beautiful. Thanks so much. I'm going to have to read what I wrote because it's just past midnight now for me, and as an early morning person, my brain's going downhill. But yeah, the idea of communities relocating as a whole as opposed to partial relocation, I think is a really interesting one. I think the idea of forcing communities to relocate as a whole is, would be fraught with many complex issues if that was the case. But one thing I was chatting to Hannah about in the chat was sort of this idea of, the type of society or community that you're working with relocation and what sort of underlying values and ways that they see a community, you know, and the way that they understand a community, and this idea of sort of more individual, you know, individual land ownership and individual choice and individual freedom, as opposed to a more collective framing around community and around land. And I think that those two things can sort of speak to different outcomes and different choices that people make in relocation. But, you know, every case is going to be unique. But yeah, I'll leave that there and throw it over to somebody else if they have anything that they want to say about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, for summarizing again. And I see another very good question from Lauren on the differences between communities or individuals that have financial capacities compared to those that haven't, and how that impacts decision-making, long-term resilience, and adaptive capacity. And I would like to ask Carolien and Olumuyiwa to please answer to this if they want.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a good question. So I respond part of it, but I will repeat it. So when the selection was made, it was mostly done in the temporary accommodation centers. So people who fled to these, they became eligible for relocation. But people who had fled to safer areas to stay with friends or with relatives who were living in a bit better place, they basically missed out that opportunity. And some of them regretted, and others were also not willing to leave. If, for instance, you had invested in a relatively solid house, and at that moment there was not yet the prospect of receiving improved houses in these relocation sites, people also said, yeah, but I'm not going to leave, because who is going to compensate me for this if I leave this house? Because this place is now declared a high-risk area. It's not supposed to, I'm not supposed to, I cannot sell it even though I've had permission officially. I obtained permission to live in this area from the local authorities by the time I settled here, but by now I will not be able to sell this house anymore. So if I just leave, I just basically lose all the investments that I made. So I guess that's where there is a little bit of leveling. And what I pointed out, I think the important question is also how people in host communities or neighboring communities respond to newcomers, especially if resettled, relocated people at some point are better off than the ones who have receded their land. And that's, I guess, a very critical question also for the future of how this whole process will unfold further. I hope that responds. And maybe very quickly, if I may, because there was a question about the titling. So I wanted to just briefly, because I didn't say it in the presentation, but the photo which I'm showing now, that's really the official document that this person received in 2019 as an ownership document over the residential plot. So somebody was asking about the titles that people received. So this is the title indeed. It's this very little piece of paper. So yeah, just very briefly.
Thank you, Carolien. Olumuyiwa, do you want to also give this question a shot?
Okay, thanks, Lauren, for the question and for the insights from Carolien. Maybe I should just add that the three contexts I pointed out have, not to sound negative, has tried to improve access to people living in slums. And generally with people living in slums, they don't have a title, a secure tenure, so they can claim some form of formal ownership to the land. So they don't have any sort of right, in quote, to want to stay. So the state generally wants to move everybody into the new housing, and they want to clear off the slum and use the land for something else, either to build new housing for more people or to sell it off, or for whatever, and it's usually fueled by the global aspiration for world-class city status, which is common with city governments in Africa. So the question of a choice to stay is always not an option in most of this relocation. So you have to move and get on with the times, or you go somewhere else, because these are not, you don't have that formal tie to the land. So in the case of South Africa, it's fully subsidized for qualifying households. In the Ds, it's subsidized, not fully subsidized, so you still have to make some down payments and pay overtime, but it's subsidized such that more people, I wouldn't say most people, can afford, because it's also, the supply is also not sufficient. About 500,000 units have been developed, but the registry of those needing those houses is about 1 million persons in the city. So in Nairobi, it's also the same thing. The supply is really behind in terms of the demand. So the question of staying is always not there. But I agree that it tends to reinforce inequalities. Of course, some become better, but not everyone becomes better enough to stay well in those new housing. Yeah. And this provide links to the aspects of climate adaptive capacity and the likes. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for providing us with the insights from a South African perspective. We have another question by Case, which is for Ryan, because he's pointing out how it's not very common to having to look at that many different sites and relocation processes and comparing them. And he's wondering whether you have seen any differences in the approaches that NGOs are taking based on the different cases that you looked at.
Yeah, I saw a number of differences, which led to those long-term differences in outcomes. Thank you for the question, Kate. I'll just note that many of the NGOs, again, the government essentially had no, they had no participation. It was NGOs who bought land, who worked with the people in the temporary shelters, who did everything. And so a lot of the strategies, people were just drawing, the directors were just drawing from their own personal experience. So in some cases, it was a church group that was focusing on, well, we want to make this kind of like a religious community. In other cases, it was, one of the cases, it was the Red Cross, the IFRC. And so they had their own protocols on how to work with the community. But again, it was contextualized within the Honduran culture and the times. And so unfortunately, there was very little communication also between the directors of these organizations. Had there been so, I think that there could have been better outcomes for many of them, because they could have shared lessons learned, but that wasn't the case.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting this lack of communication between this organization that could have helped in a more successful, in quotes, relocation. I also have another question for Narjes. You said, or you were comparing the experiences of relocation between Afghans in Iran and Iranians. Can you maybe elaborate on the differences in the experience that Afghan refugees have that have been relocated, or Iranians within Iran?
To be honest, since I have done my research basically on the Afghan relocation and resettlements, I think I'm not in a position to compare those two. But the only thing I can say is that according to the, for instance, mobility map that I've showed you, the refugees, they do not have the right to move or live in most part of the countries and provinces. And rather than being a kind of plan for them, this is somehow some kind of security consideration behind this, relocation and moving between the provinces. So in answering your question, I can say that, for instance, for Iranians relocation, which is happening quite often, we do not have such, consideration in terms of security issues or limitations. And I recently came across one very nice policy brief introduced by IOM and UNEP in August 2023. And there were some very nice suggestions and recommendations in terms of international, frameworks. And one of those was in order to integrate the displaced population into national adaptation plans, we would need to give them the right to move freely, but I was thinking with myself, how could we contextualize such nice international framework when we do have certain limitation in terms of national regulation and limitations? Thank you for your question, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you for pointing out these limitations. I have one final question for whoever wants to jump in. So all of your work has been based on case studies, and they're super important because we all know relocation is context specific. But do you think there's a chance that your insights can also be applied to the same country, but a different community, or even to a different country? And since I see Carolien nodding, I'm gonna pass to you, and then anyone else who wants to answer this very difficult question can jump in, please.
Yeah, I guess it's indeed a tricky question, and you don't want to too easily use blueprints which you assume will work everywhere. But I think there are some pointers of, for instance, looking at the relation between resettled people and members of neighboring communities, of host communities, into looking into community building. These are issues that you should pay attention to everywhere. And how it actually is done in practice, that could vary. But I think there are some pointers which you could raise, which I guess are important to pay attention to everywhere. Like, how do people rebuild their lives and livelihoods? How do these communities get along? How do they reconstitute themselves? Those are, I guess, important issues. The question of access to land and how it is secured. Well, it's partly also because it's something that I'm interested in, but I think it's also an important question in many of these places. So yeah, I guess you could distill some sort of common elements there to pay attention to, and then still tailor that to local realities.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Does anybody want to jump in on that tricky question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just.
Yeah, maybe I can.
Oh, sorry.
Anna
you
first, and then Olumuyiwa, please.
I was just going to say, I think the importance of sharing lessons from individual case studies is 100% very, very important. It's obviously not going to speak exactly to the experience of somewhere else, but I think if we have a culture of sharing case study learnings and lessons, it allows for information that might be relevant to be picked up in different ways, in different contexts. Communities are so they're people, and human behavior is very complicated. So obviously a blueprint isn't going to speak to everything, but I think it's about a culture of sharing failures and successes that we need to have in this space, as well as adaptation more broadly, so that we can learn where it's relevant.
Great, thank you. Now Olumuyiwa, please.
Okay, Good to see these different cases and to understand the different dimensions in different contexts. From my work in informal settlements, we often regard that often heterogeneity, and I think it speaks to the range of situations where relocations are applied or are to be applied. But what's coming through for me is the key aspects, and my summary is that there are key dimensions, the livelihoods dimensions, the social dimensions, and the technical dimensions in itself. And the technical dimensions would refer to the extent of climate risk. So if it's really going to, there is a risk of sea level rise, and if people don't move, they might never survive. Then in such a case, the issue of social cohesion and livelihoods might come secondary. But in some instances, livelihood might trump others. So I think we have like a toolbox or a boxes. I mean, some don't like boxes because it's easy to tick and not do anything. But you have this toolbox for which you can match each community and then know what should be number one, what should be number two, what should be number three. That's my key takeaway from these cases. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you for this input. And you made the perfect transition for me because this session is coming to an end. And as for the other sessions, I also wanted to ask you for your key insight or key takeaway. And we're going to take the same order as for the presentations, and please keep it in like a 30 or 40-second frame. So please, Anna, go ahead.
Beautiful. So I think my key takeaway might just be because I gave all of mine at the end of my presentation. I think I down everyone's throat. But that being a part of this session has just been so interesting, hearing from the different case studies in the different global contexts. And yeah, like we were just saying then, the similarities and the differences, I think, is just really, really interesting to see how every relocation is both similar and different. And that, yeah, I just feel very grateful to have been able to present with these amazing people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. My key takeaway is, I mean, relocation is quite complex. I mean, it could be like eating an elephant, but you take it one piece at a time. So to me, the issue of relocation should be taken one case at a time in order to weigh every relevant issue and find the best way out. Yeah. Thanks.
If I may, I think what I really learned from the session so far, and this session in particular, is that other than being complex, relocation needs to be understood throughout the different frames and sequences of a journey, and this complex trajectory should be understood like in a complex manner and with different sequences, I would say.
Well, let me then build on that, onto that as well. I think this complexity and the trajectory that you both mentioned, they also show that we shouldn't too easily judge how relocation is done and say that, well, we need to look for success, of course, and there's always failures to see, but it's also a process which takes a lot of time. So also give it that time before judging too easily, because there's simply a lot to do. And if you hear, for instance, the stories of some of the more practice-oriented people in this week, it's not an easy task. And I guess as a researcher, at least I feel I'm at a comfortable side in sort of saying how things work and don't work. But it's always much easier to say that things don't work than to say how things could work, and also give it that time to assess. And thanks all for these very nice contributions.
I agree with everything that was already shared. I was once asked, you know, sum up your dissertation or your book in one sentence, and it's people who move need help. And I think really figuring out how best to support survivors or those who are being relocated at every level, the local level, the agency level, the state level, the federal government level, and what can the international community do? All of those are important and relevant, but the local is the most important.
Great. Thank you so much for those amazing insights and also for being concise. So thank you to the panelists. Thanks to those who woke up early. Thanks for those who stayed up quite late for us. We're really appreciative. And also thank you to the participants for joining us. I also want to recognize and thank all the partners for organizing the Climate Academy, so UNU-EHS, as well as the Munich Re Foundation, in coordination with IOM and the UNFCCC. And I also quickly want to advertise the final session of the online part of the Climate Academy, which is taking place tomorrow. And it will be on how to support communities effectively, steps forward, and do's and don'ts. And I think this will be a great wrap-up session for this virtual part of the Climate Academy. And it's taking place tomorrow from 1 to 2:30 CET. Thanks again for being here. I wish you a lovely rest of your day and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.